In the late 1940s, my grandparents found themselves in a picturesque German town, nestled amidst the scenic landscapes of Bavaria. Their diverse heritage, spanning various corners of the Middle East, had led them to this new land. Leaving behind their beloved Alexandria, Egypt, they now resided in a charming old villa, previously owned by an Italian family. The villa, standing proudly with its 2 stories, had become their cherished abode. Although they had recently moved in, just a month before the arrival of their firstborn, my father, they managed to furnish it adequately to provide a comfortable living space. Among the carefully selected pieces was a crib, eagerly awaiting the imminent arrival of their bundle of joy. One fateful night, the clock struck 10, and my grandmother found herself alone in the dimly lit bedroom of the villa. Her husband, my grandfather, was absent, attending to an evening appointment. Despite her exhaustion, my grandmother eagerly awaited his return, reclining in bed with her drowsy newborn cradled in her arms. As weariness washed over her, my grandmother closed her eyes, seeking a few moments of respite. However, a peculiar sensation gradually seeped into her consciousness, compelling her to reopen her eyes. To her astonishment, she found herself gazing upon an otherworldly sight, an apparition of a woman with lustrous blonde locks, dressed in a black gown, serenely perched on one of the chairs in the room. Although translucent, the figure possessed an ethereal quality, unlike any mortal being my grandmother had encountered before. Despite the enigmatic nature of the encounter, my grandmother was convinced she wasn't dreaming. An inexplicable certainty enveloped her senses. Shortly thereafter, the sound of my grandfather's voice resonated from the front door. Accidentally forgetting his keys, he sought my grandmother's assistance in gaining entry. Stirred from her perplexing reverie, my grandmother reluctantly rose from the bed, passing by the mysterious blonde woman, who turned her head to observe the newborn nestled safely in my grandmother's arms. Together they ventured out of the bedroom to welcome my grandfather back home. After recounting the bewildering encounter, my grandmother's words fell upon skeptical ears. My grandfather, burdened by exhaustion from the day's toils, dismissed her experience as the product of fatigue and the challenges of adjusting to life with a newborn. Frustration clouded my grandmother's thoughts as their argument escalated, eventually prompting my grandfather to seek refuge in an unoccupied room upstairs. In the solitude of the dimly lit, sparsely furnished space, my grandfather lay on a sturdy couch, seeking solace in slumber. However, as he closed his eyes, an unsettling presence enveloped the room, penetrating his consciousness. Half expecting a conciliatory visit from my grandmother, he opened his eyes, only to be met with the same ethereal blonde woman his wife had encountered earlier. Standing beside the couch, her gaze fixed upon my grandfather, she exuded an inexplicable aura. Driven by instinct rather than conscious thought, my grandfather leaped from the couch, bolting out of the room in haste. The details of that fleeting moment remained blurred in his memory, uncertain whether he had passed through the specter or around it. Seeking solace and understanding, he descended the stairs, urgently sharing his encounter with my grandmother. Throughout their years in the villa, my grandparents and their children experienced an array of paranormal phenomena. The blonde woman, an apparition from the villa's enigmatic past, made frequent appearances, leaving an indelible mark on their lives. We bought a historic home built in the 1890s in 1999, located in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Munich, Germany. This quaint house was originally an old school, which had been converted into a residential property. Despite its dilapidated interior, we were drawn to its architectural charm and the opportunity to own a piece of history at a reasonable price. The previous owner, an elderly woman suffering from dementia, was coerced into selling the property by her daughter, who was her legal guardian. According to our realtor, the old lady had been experiencing vivid hallucinations and delusions, making it unsafe for her to live alone. The daughter claimed her mother heard phantom footsteps, rocks being hurled onto the roof, and other inexplicable sounds. In a disconcerting discovery, we found the words, aneurysm, and death, scrawled on the wall of a second-floor bedroom in the elderly lady's lipstick. It was a grim reminder of her late husband's tragic passing in that very room due to an aneurysm. The daughter's concern was understandable, but little did we know what awaited us. The house, with its 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, required extensive renovations. The bathroom itself was a later addition, built onto an outer wall of the first floor. The remaining 2 bedrooms were nestled in what used to be the attic space, boasting slanted walls following the roofline and tiny closets. We envisioned it as an ideal children's area, a playroom where our girls could share a bedroom. Little did we anticipate the horrors that would unfold. Shortly after moving in, we began the arduous task of refurbishing the house. Night after night, we toiled away, tearing out old flooring, painting walls, and wallpapering. As we delved deeper into the renovation process, we discovered a hidden secret within the walls. Behind layers of decaying plaster, we unearthed a woman's button-up shoe and a collection of old medical bottles. The shoe, damp and molded from the house's moisture, held an eerie energy, while the bottle seemed to emit an unexplained warmth when touched. Wrapped in an old newspaper that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, these artifacts left us with a lingering sense of unease. It wasn't long before strange occurrences began to unfold. A pervasive feeling of being watched plagued us, not just myself but several others who visited the house, a visiting electrician, the pest control inspector, my mother, 2 friends, and even my older daughter. One fateful evening, while my daughter and I were painting the walls around 11 p.m., we heard distinct footsteps echoing from the floor above. Knowing that we were the only ones present, we hastily abandoned our work and fled. The following day, upon returning, we discovered that all the lights were mysteriously switched on, despite leaving the house in complete darkness the night before. Even our pets, a cat and dog, displayed unusual behavior, huddling in a corner and whimpering, refusing to enter the house any longer. One night, as we painted the kitchen, a peculiar incident occurred. I absent-mindedly placed my car keys, attached to a lanyard, on the kitchen counter. My teenage daughter witnessed the act. However, when we were ready to leave, the keys had vanished into thin air. We scoured the house, growing increasingly frantic, but they were nowhere to be found. In frustration and with no other options, we resigned ourselves to sleeping in the car parked in the driveway that night. The following morning, the lanyard materialized, lying on the kitchen floor. It was an inexplicable occurrence that defied all logical explanation. Alarmed by these incidents, we changed the locks in a desperate bid to regain a sense of security. Yet, our efforts proved futile. On one occasion, we arrived at the house to discover all the light bulbs had been mysteriously loosened from their sockets. We replaced the fixtures, only for the electrician we hired to report a disconcerting encounter. While working in the cellar, he distinctly heard his name being called from behind, despite being alone in the house. I, myself, was upstairs at the time, and there was no one else present. Our anxiety grew with each passing day. Kitchen cabinets, which were secured with snap locks, would be found wide open without any logical explanation. We would hear the disconcerting sound of rocks being thrown onto the roof, yet no rocks or individuals could be found nearby. The pest control inspector, who had previously sprayed the house, experienced his name being whispered from the depths of the cellar and adamantly refused to return. A sense of foreboding loomed over the house, and the encounters became increasingly terrifying. During a visit from a close friend, who aided my husband in carpeting the second floor, a chilling sight materialized. As he glanced into a mirror, he caught a glimpse of a distorted face lurking behind him. This image profoundly unsettled him, even as a seasoned Air Force captain who had faced the horrors of war. My husband, though skeptical, could no longer dismiss the mounting evidence. As the strange phenomena persisted, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. My mother reported seeing a shadowy figure peering through the heat grating in the floor, where hot water pipes once ran, providing warmth throughout the house. During a family picnic in the yard, my nephew ventured into the house alone to use the restroom. At the top of the stairs, he encountered a figure that sent shivers down his spine. My mother, too, recognized it as the same dark figure she had seen before. And then there was the morning we discovered a knife, inexplicably lying on the floor, far from its drawer. The house had become a menacing entity, tormenting us with its insidious presence. Haunted by these relentless encounters, we could no longer endure the horrors within those walls. After a year of living in a constant state of fear, we made the difficult decision to sell the house. Renting it proved equally challenging, with tenants experiencing unexplainable disturbances, leading us to believe that the house itself was the source of the inexplicable events. Eventually, we parted ways with the property, and now, where once stood a house brimming with malevolence, a parking lot serves as a haunting reminder of the horrors we endured. It was a chapter of our lives that needed closure, a testament to the sinister forces that can reside within even the most innocuous of dwellings. When I lived with my mother in the enchanting city of York, England, she would often recount a haunting tale associated with the staircase leading to our apartment. According to her, a tragic incident had occurred there, resulting in the demise of a young girl. While I couldn't see these apparitions, I possessed an uncanny ability to sense their presence, a peculiar combination of the sensation of being watched and subtle glimpses in my mind's eye. It was a complex and unsettling experience, to say the least. After my mother moved out, I found myself encountering a distinct presence in the living room, particularly during the nighttime hours. Growing weary of this constant eerie sensation, I sought assistance, and a well-meaning individual suggested a ritual to communicate with the entity and urge it to depart. As an atheist, I approached the ritual with skepticism but decided to give it a try. Following their guidance, I selected a Buddha statue I owned, attributing symbolic significance to it, and placed it slightly elevated in front of me. With closed eyes, I summoned all my courage and addressed the unseen presence, intuiting that it was a man in his 30s or 40s. "Please, I implore you to leave this house. It is my home, and your presence makes me profoundly uncomfortable." Remarkably, after the ritual, the presence ceased, and I no longer felt its ethereal company. However, a few weeks later, a disconcerting new phenomenon emerged. As I ventured out of the living room towards the bathroom, I sensed the presence of a young child following closely behind. An intense shiver ran down my spine, compelling me to swiftly retreat back to the safety of the living room, where I spent the night as the child entity stood between me and my bedroom. This pattern persisted, with the presence of the child unfailingly accompanying my nightly routines. Simultaneously, I could feel the presence of two adult entities in my mother's room. The constant sense of being pursued instead of encountering stationary spirits left me disheartened. I hesitated to repeat the ritual that had worked previously, as it was evident that these entities were not of a benevolent nature. During one night, I had a girlfriend staying over, who possessed the ability to see and interact with spirits. We engaged in casual conversation while lying in bed, unaware that the ethereal entities stood silently beside us, observing our every move. Resolute in my belief that ghosts posed no threat, I chose to disregard their presence. However, upon waking up the following morning, the spirits had vanished entirely. As I descended to the living room, preparing myself for a meal, a bizarre incident occurred. My soda can inexplicably started sliding to the side, almost tumbling to the floor. Reacting swiftly, I managed to catch it just in time. The unnerving occurrence further solidified my decision to vacate the premises, as I no longer felt safe within those walls. Fortunately, I never had to return to that place after nightfall, seeking solace in a new, spirit-free dwelling. My friend, Elena, and I relocated to a 2-story building in Brașov, Romania. We rented a flat on the first floor while the other 2 floors remained vacant, unoccupied by anyone. During the initial days of our stay, everything seemed normal. However, on the 4th day, strange occurrences began to unfold. I found myself overwhelmed with grief as if I had lost a child, despite not being married or having any children of my own. I constantly felt exhausted and found myself in tears frequently. In the middle of the night, I would be startled awake by eerie sounds, sometimes the wailing of a woman, the laughter of a child, or the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. One fateful night, as I opened my eyes to a slight tug on my blanket, I saw a woman standing at the edge of my bed. In a fleeting moment, she vanished into thin air. I caught a glimpse of her wearing a light pink salwar kameez, with flowing hair, and she appeared to be in her early 30s. At first, I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, trying to rationalize the experience. To seek answers, I approached a shopkeeper nearby and inquired about the history of the house. He revealed a tragic tale from a few years prior. A family had resided in the flat. Unfortunately, their 6-year-old son had a fatal accident, falling from the terrace. Overwhelmed by grief, the mother took her own life within the confines of the house. After her passing, the father relocated to another city, leaving the haunting memories behind. The shopkeeper's revelation sent chills down my spine, as it aligned with the eerie events Elena and I had been experiencing. We decided to leave the flat immediately, unable to bear the weight of the sorrowful presence any longer. We had resided there for a mere 3 months. My heart ached for the family who had endured such unimaginable tragedy. From that day forward, I vowed never to return to that flat, shunning any reminders of the haunted past. The year was 1999, but the haunting tale still lingers in my memory, a testament to the sorrow that once consumed those walls. When my mother was a young woman, her parents moved to an old wood frame house that was by a creek on the outskirts of San Antonio. It was a rude and rough-looking shack. There was an old screened-in porch out in the back where they could sleep if the weather was too hot. My mother and her 2 other sisters were sleeping at the house. The other 2 oldest sisters were married and the younger 2 boys joined the armed forces. Lila, Minerva, Teresa. Minerva was my mother. These 3 sisters were still at home working. 2 were waitresses and the other one worked as a sales clerk. It was a 2-bedroom house. Lila and Minnie would work at a restaurant. Sometimes they would work late at night. Then they would have to catch the bus to ride home. This is just to give a peek into their lives. It was very stressful, and this was during the WW2. One night the girls came home after work to find their parents terrified. They wanted to know what was going on. Their father told them that they heard something heavy dragging across the wooden floors. It sounded like someone was dragging a piece of heavy meat over it. My mother and aunts blew them off, making wisecracks about rationing and having meat to put on table for once. Their mom and dad were getting meat or beef obsessed because of the war, I guess. They were sleeping on the floor of the kitchen. Why, you asked? Because the wood-burning stove was there, and it kept them warm in the winter, when all of a sudden they heard the noise that their parents were talking about. Then they got a whiff of some awful smell. They explained that it smelled of rotten fish, carnations, and rotten eggs. They have never smelled anything like that in their lives. This was getting to be the norm instead of the exception at the house. Every night at around 4 in the morning this would occur. They would all get up and look for the smell in the morning. The 3 sisters were doing some investigation about the sound of dragging sound. Unfortunately, they had to stop because they had to go to work. The sisters decided to pitch in and buy some flashlights or torches for all the members of the family. Back then it was expensive, and the war was raging. This was a big purchase for them. This was back when the customers that tip a dime was a good customer. Mom and her love affair with dimes. Well, anyway, back to the story. that night they were prepared. My grandmother had a pot of coffee boiling, and they were all waiting for the show to begin, sitting by the kerosene lamps. They were sitting at the kitchen table quietly talking among themselves, when they heard the disturbing and strange noise. Minnie said that her father was the first one grabbed the flashlight, and he ran only to stop short at their front room. He froze. Minnie said that he was crying because he was so frightened. Grandfather Peter was shaking so bad. While Minnie was comforting him and bringing him back to the warm and semi-bright kitchen to his wife, my other aunts rushed and saw a shadow crossing the floor. I remember years later they said that this shadow looked like it had substance. This shadow went into the floorboard and disappeared. They stood there trying to comprehend what happened, that is when the stench came wafting in again. The three sisters decided they had enough of this and went back to the kitchen, where it was lighted and warm. Nobody slept that night, as you can imagine. You had 5 people sleeping on pallets on that kitchen floor. I can't imagine that. In the morning the women got up and went to see where that shadow disappeared to. They noticed something that they never noticed before. There was a tuft of fine white hair sticking out of floorboard. They pulled it out, and it was a photo of an old German couple with hair, herbs, roots wrapped with red floss. The German couple or someone did some powwow, and that was haunting the place. Maybe they were punishing the couple by binding them there so that they couldn't move on, or maybe the couple had such a happy life there they didn't want to move on, and they didn't want anyone else there. Who knew? My great-aunts took over, my grandmother's sisters, and they disposed of the couple in the photo and all manner of the spell work. The haunting stopped. That was a very welcome relief. The sisters went back to their jobs well rested and happy. Peter and Amelia were happy to be with each other company. I wish I could say they lived happily ever after, but 3 months later my grandfather died. My grandfather Peter told my grandmother Amelia that night he saw himself in a coffin all laid out with people that he knew at his wake. That was what scared him. He died in April of that year.